Hello and welcome. My name is Charles Lister and I'm the Director of the Countering Terrorism and Extremism Programme at the Middle East Institute. I'm really thrilled to welcome you to today's inaugural MEI Counterterrorism Conference, which this year, as you'll know, is being hosted virtually to the public worldwide. Throughout the day, we'll have 3 panels featuring an array of esteemed subject matter experts and practitioners. And at lunchtime, Washington time, we'll hold a keynote conversation with John Godfrey, the US State Department's acting coordinator for counterterrorism and acting special envoy to the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS. Later this day, we'll mark the 20-year anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, a horrifying assault on the United States by Al-Qaeda, the consequences of which continue to be felt here at home and abroad. In the years since, the US and its allies have pursued aggressive and targeted campaigns against Al-Qaeda and more recently against ISIS, wherever their activities posed a serious threat to international security. While we in America may well be safer from another 9/11 style attack than at any time since 2001, the global threats posed by terrorism are now greater in number, more diverse in scope, and more potentially potent than at any point since. As MEI non-resident scholar Doug London recently wrote in an excellent policy paper entitled Rethinking US Counterterrorism Strategy, while terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS have innovated and adapted, US counterterrorism strategy has remained largely unchanged, fighting yesterday's war while neglecting present-day threats, as well as those over the near horizon. From assessing the local, global, and glocal terror threats of today to addressing international perspectives on 20 years of CT policy and attempting to piece together lessons learned in order to determine more effective paths forward, today's conference has a lot to cover and a wealth of expertise to attempt to do so. So once again, thank you for joining us today. And without further ado, let me take my virtual seat and pass the mic over to Eric Schmidt of the New York Times, who will be moderating our first panel of the day.
Well, thank you, Charles, and hello, everyone, and welcome to the first panel of the Middle East Institute's 2021 Counterterrorism Conference, hosted by MEI's Countering Terrorism and Extremism program. I'm Eric Schmidt, a senior national security correspondent for the New York Times, and will be moderating the discussion Local, Global, and Glocal, assessing today's terrorism threats. The threats and challenges posed by jihadist terrorism have arguably never been more diverse and more widely distributed as they are today. Tackling local, global, or glocal terrorism threats requires different tactical and strategic approaches and presents a difficult question of what to prioritize, where and when. This panel will seek to understand these varying approaches and to determine how best to deal with them as terrorist actors. To discuss these issues, we have a distinguished panel of experts. First, I would like to introduce Colonel Christopher Costa. Chris is the Executive Director of the International Spy Museum and formerly was the Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Counterterrorism of the National Security Council. Next, I would like to welcome Karen Greenberg. Karen is the Director of the Center on National Security at Fordham University School of Law. We have MEI's Charles Lister on the panel. Charles is a senior fellow and director of the Countering Terrorism and Extremism in Syria programs. And finally, we have Lieutenant General Michael Nagata. Mike is a distinguished senior fellow of the Middle East Institute and senior vice president and strategic advisor at CACI International. Mike was the former director of strategy at the US National Counterterrorism Center. We're going to be discussing among ourselves for about an hour or so many of these topics, and then we'll throw it open to Q&A for the last half an hour or so. To submit your questions, please use the Zoom Q&A feature on the Zoom call here, which you can find on the bottom of your screens. For those calling in by phone or watching the panel on live stream, you can ask a question by emailing to events@mei.edu. If you have any technical issues, just please email events@mei.edu. Feel free to ask a question at any time throughout the panel. I'll be looking at all your questions. We'll factor as many as possible into the discussion. I wanted to kind of open with this thought of here we are, of course, with this new administration dealing with the fallout from the January 6th riots on Capitol Hill. There's another hearing today on the causes of that. We'll be testifying. and the rising concerns about domestic terrorism here in the United States. There are multiple investigations into the threat posed by white supremacists and other right-wing extremist groups. But as Charles said in his introduction, there's still very much of a very potent international terrorism threat out there. The UN recently estimated there's still some 10,000 ISIS fighters that have gone to ground in Iraq and Syria. The Sahel region, which I visited about a year ago in Burkina Faso, is imploding. The deadly confluence of groups, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and other militant mix that is threatening the stability of that whole area, also threatening with the French talking about drawing down their forces there. So there are a number of various threats that are coming together for this new administration to tackle. And Chris, I thought I'd turn to you first to kind of look at this, because it's really kind of a two-sided coin here, it seems, where you have the threat of domestic terrorism, which many people, obviously, it's been there for a long time. You know, we're just thinking about Merrick Garland's nomination hearing and kind of reprising a lot of the Oklahoma City bombing case back in 1995, all the way up to current day and the present here, but obviously still very much of a threat, whether it's from Al-Qaeda, ISIS, or other more nebulous actors, as we saw just a couple of weeks ago with the rocket attacks in Erbil against the locations there. The wounded one U.S. service member killed one non-American contractor and wounded several others. So give us your sense of how these are two knitted together and how Americans should be thinking about these two sides of the coin.
Well, first, Eric, thanks. It's always nice to see you, and it's a privilege to be able to participate in MEI's forum today. So I'll just jump right in it and say that from an ideology standpoint, as an actor outside the government now, I would argue that jihadism and accelerationism, so to your point, January 6th, they are not unrelated from an ideological standpoint. They're both apocalyptic in terms of ideology. And we put a great deal, when I say we, the coalition, the United States in particular, for 4 years in the previous administration, we put a great deal of pressure on our adversaries overseas. And we recognize that some success would be making these organizations, forcing them to ground, like ISIS specifically, and essentially preventing them from being a threat on our shores. All of that's our being the United States, of course. All of that said, the fact that the threat is local right now does not mean that that threat has gone away. Clearly, and it's implied by some of the remarks already, the fact that our adversaries have gone to ground is going to make it more challenging to ferret them out, to find them, and to continue put pressure on them overseas, in particular because US forces have drawn down in the Middle East. So I guess I would say the current administration has a dual problem now, whereas 4 years ago, we were very much zeroed in on the international terrorism threat, the physical caliphate, taking that away from ISIS, which I think the collective we, 73 plus coalition members did an extraordinary job of taking that caliphate away. That said, 4 years later, we have not an either or proposition. We have concerns regarding domestic terrorism and we have an overseas threat. So we have to be dialed in on two threat streams. We can't take our eyes off the ball. And the last point, because I've gone on too long, is we have to focus on grievances. We have to continue to focus on ideology. And we sound collectively like a broken record, but we've never got at those issues as we should have collectively.
Well, that's a good segue to Karen. I wanted to ask you about the conditions that are leading both the resiliency of this kind of international jihadist terrorism, but now as we learn more about some of these domestic groups, there was a very frightening article in the Washington Post yesterday about QAnon and kind of support groups for QAnon family members. What's your sense of what these conditions are, and have they been changing over the years? I think you're on mute, Karen.
That's what
Yeah.
happens when you start this early in the morning.
There you
So it's such a good question. First, let me thank MEI for hosting this panel. Couldn't be better timing, unfortunately. And I want to thank Chris for bringing up the notion of grievances and just sort of set out what I think this larger context is, which is that, yes, there have been reports of escalating and proliferating groups in terms of violence in the Middle East and elsewhere, the larger Middle East and in parts of Africa. And yes, we have this terrorist, domestic terrorism movement of a variety of strands coming to life in the United States with new powers. But I think in some ways we need to keep them separate. I think there's been a lot of talk, and I think it's legitimate, about ways in which the international jihadist movement, its techniques, its narrative, its strategies have been copied and studied by domestic terrorists, whether it's QAnon or others. This is actually an extraordinarily interesting fact, because the grievances, this larger category that Chris Costa is referring to, are actually very different. They're the same in terms of exclusionary. But if you look at what's happening in the Middle East, and you see the conditions that are giving rise to these new waves of terrorism, what the Middle East Institute calls recrudescence. If you see what's happening, you see that the grievances are proliferating, and the grievances have to do with very basic things in life, like protection, which terrorist groups are offering in the midst of this chaos and violence, like food, like water. I mean, if you think about that and what's happening over there and what the conditions are that are giving rise to terrorism and that are feared to be giving rise to more and more terrorism, as the conditions don't really seem to know how to get around them, our intelligence, military, and aid agendas are not enough. And then you look at home at our domestic terrorists, the grievances they have are actually very different. They are racially based, very unhappy about the direction the United States has been taking for the last 150 years. And so I think in terms of looking at the methods and the strategies, they may look the same, but really if we're going to understand the drivers, the motivations, and therefore the way to counter them, we really have to look at them in very separable ways. So I hope that's kind of what you were looking for.
Right. Mike, I wanted to turn to you kind of with all your experience, both on the ground as a former special operations officer, all the way up to the larger strategic level at NCTC, and then what you're doing now, of course, to give us kind of your view of kind of this global phenomenon and the threats and to what, and I like the panel, we can please jump in anytime. I like the idea of Karen, she's put out on the table that, maybe these two things are separate, domestic terrorism and international. I'd like to get, kind of the panel's thoughts after that. But Mike, what's your sense?
Thanks, Eric. It's great to see everybody. And of course, I'll begin by thanking the Institute for allowing me to participate, particularly among this august body of colleagues that I'm with. But to your question, Eric, unfortunately, and I think we've already, I'm in some ways, I'm just parroting what you've already heard here this morning. As a former strategist in the counterterrorism field, as well as a practitioner, I am convinced, very sadly, that there is a continued expansion of violent extremism of all types globally, including inside the United States. And I want to give credit where credit's due. Both the United States and the international community have a lot of successes over the years, a lot of things we can point at that we can and should be proud of, particularly where we have successfully secured or saved people's lives. But that hasn't prevented, in my view, the scope and the danger of violent extremism continuing to grow regardless of the world's best efforts. And I think that is true internationally. I also believe it is true inside our own country. One of the more sobering examples of this, as I suspect many of the people in the audience are already very aware of, is or has been the arc from Al-Qaeda in Iraq many years ago to the phenomenon of the Islamic State today. Just as a quick factoid, when I was a task force commander in Iraq many years ago, I vividly remember counting the number of foreign fighters that had flocked to the Al Qaeda in Iraq banner in the hundreds. Several years later, when I was the commander of special operations forces in the Middle East, and having to deal with the Islamic State, we were counting foreign fighters for ISIS in the tens of thousands. That is a very dangerous trajectory. And despite all the damage that the US and the coalition have done, and we should be very proud of that, in liberating places like Mosul, Raqqa, what have you. But despite all of that, the global expansion of ISIS franchises, as well as what we are now seeing is a resurgence of ISIS in both Iraq and Syria, has already basically neutralized that original damage that we've done. And perhaps just as importantly, this brand of terrorism remains incredibly attractive and successful even today. Another thing you can look at is the enormous expansion of domestic violent extremism within the United States, which both of my colleagues have now referenced. This is not new. The signs of growing extremism of various types in the US has been growing for decades, but frankly, we've not paid much attention to it. Well, we're paying attention now, but why? Because it has grown to such a proportion, and it is so dangerous now that we have no choice but to pay attention to it. Finally, I'm going to make an argument here. It is an arguable proposition, but I personally believe it's true. There's a lot of talk in this town these days about having to balance our national security efforts against two competing priorities. One being terrorism or violent extremism, whether at home or abroad, or what we are styling as great power competition, are concerned with so-called near-peer adversaries. And a lot of the talk that I hear in this town is about how we must do less of one in order to do more of the other. And it's an attractive, understandable idea. I personally believe it is misguided. And one of the most important reasons I believe it is misguided is I personally believe that violent extremism and what we are calling great power competition are converging and overlapping with each other in growing ways and growing places around the world. I'll close by just giving you a couple of examples of what I mean by this. But if I'm right about this, it means we simply can't afford to pay attention to one over the other because they're increasingly becoming, in some ways, the same problem. The first example, and I'm not trying to get into the debate about whether or not this particular tribal group is a formally declared terrorist organization or not, but the Houthis in northern Yemen, who are a non-state actor that use violence to accomplish their political goals, have become incredibly effective high technology proxies for the nation state of Iran. So terrorism and great power competition in the same sentence. The final one is if you cast your mind back to the activities of ethnic Russian separatists in the Ukraine using what was clearly first world military capability and technology on behalf of Russia in the Ukraine, that is also an example. Whether or not those ethnic separatist groups are legally or formally declared to be terrorist groups, they certainly have the attributes of terrorist groups. And this is, again, a convergence. And why is this happening? Because extremist groups of all types, as they get more and more access to affordable, very powerful high technology, are irresistibly attractive to too many nation states that, much as proxy warfare has been a feature of human civilization ever since the dawn of mankind, they are very useful, convenient proxies to do bleeding and dying for the nation state that's trying to secure its own interests. I know that's very uplifting, but that's the way I wanted to start this morning.
Well, Charles, kind of picking up on that point, looking at, say, Russia and its involvement in Syria, a place where you've studied for years and years, obviously in stoking the movement there, but also, as we've seen so dramatically over the last few years, Russia's involvement here in the United States in trying to incite domestic groups. Where do you see the crossover here as well, or how should we distinguish that?
Well, I mean, I think Mike hits the nail on the head in terms of raising the importance of proxies, and I think proxy warfare and the interconnection between proxy warfare, great power competition, and violent extremism is a fact now. It's not even emerging. It is now a driving fuel of conflict and instability, not just in the Middle East, but I think you can find areas in Africa where this is becoming increasingly the case. And if you want to highlight Russia, you need only look at all of their little green men and private military contractors who are poking their heads up in all kinds of corners of Africa, backing dictatorial rulers, but also in so doing, I think, helping drive and fuel pre-existing insurgencies and sort of rebel movements. And I think that's going to increasingly be the case. I think you can also, frankly, make an argument that, you know, US involvement all around the world has probably contributed in a similar way. If you look at it from the perspective of extremist organizations, any external interference in foreign countries will always drive nefarious actors who need those kind of grievances. And I do really want to stress the importance of that word here, because I think it's absolutely central. No matter where you look, the grievances and drivers that are fueling extremism of all kinds are becoming more deeply embedded, more potent, more in your face, I think, than they have been for at least a very long time, if not beyond any of our memories. And I'm by far the youngest person on this panel, but perhaps everyone else would agree with me. But I think when you look at the Middle East, and especially when you look at places like Syria, you know, another point sort of comes to mind, which I kind of want to emphasize as well, which is, okay, so we're 10 years on from the Arab Spring. Not a great deal of good has come from that wave of intended change. But what has really occurred and what's being consolidated now, again, quite frankly, is the return or the reconsolidation of dictatorial rule in most of the region. And yet, at the same time, the grievances, the root causes that gave way to the many uprisings across the region are all still in place. And in Syria, in the case that I work on the most, they are all worse today than they were in 2011. But having gone through a decade of suppression, failed uprisings, you know, declining revolutions, the most worrying sort of outcome of all of that is that the avenues for what we might call moderate or mainstream opposition activity, violent or not, have become thinner than they ever have been. And that has provided extremist groups, whether they are religious or not, the best opportunity they've had in many corners of the region to attract recruits that would have perhaps otherwise not been you know, prospective recruits of an extremist organization. And, you know, I can say, having worked on Syria, that, you know, I've come to know many, many Syrians over the last 10 years, and some of them have ended up joining extremist groups, and they have no extremist ideology or personal beliefs whatsoever. But they have done that because of local conditions, local grievances, and there being no other better option to pursue their personal grievance against government and regime and dictatorship. And that, I think, I frankly worry about the most. Not necessarily saying that there's an easy solution to any of that. But when it comes to thinking about countering terrorism, we have, as I think most of the speakers have said, got very good at, to use a crass term, sort of mowing the grass. We've become very good at killing bad guys, retaking territory like the ISIS territorial Caliphate, but we haven't really addressed any of the grievances that allow these groups to flourish. And the longer we fail to do that collectively as the international community, the bigger those numbers that Mike Nagata highlighted are going to become, from hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands. As the avenue for mainstream activity dwindles, extremists are only going to benefit. But not necessarily because extremist ideologies are latching on, but because the path that they are also pursuing of resistance and a pursuit for change is becoming more and more sort of credible and attractive.
So Chris and Karen, let me ask you to build off of Charles' analysis, and that is, if you look at an organization like ISIS and their ability to kind of seize on these local grievances and kind of team up with local organizations in a symbiotic way, you have ISIS able to perhaps seem larger and expand its, may perhaps even exaggerate its threat, its size by latching onto various groups. Obviously, a local group that can label itself, slap the ISIS label on itself, gives it kind of a more fearsome aspect. I'm just thinking even more recently amongst some of the more recent ISIS affiliates, if you were in places like Eastern and Southern Africa, in Northern Mozambique, for instance. And how much of what we're going to see in the coming years is going to draw on these very local grievances and label them an ISIS affiliate or perhaps even an Al-Qaeda affiliate, or kind of the model that we all kind of, as we were studying this after 9/11, with the draw of foreign fighters, which seems to have slackened in many ways, partly because the ability of intelligence service to track them, to combat them, but obviously the ideology, that you can't tackle that at borders. And so, Chris, and then Karen, maybe you could address that in terms of kind of as you look forward to this threat we're posing. Is it really locally based, or can we still anticipate flows of foreign fighters also exacerbating the problem?
So I think to sum up, I would argue that it's going to continue to be a problem of a franchise. They're buying into a franchise. They're buying into a broad ideological buy-in, and they're going to adhere to local grievances or take advantage, better said, of local grievances. But at the same time, we can't take our eye off the long-term prize, and that is to hurt the United States. So I think maybe we could all agree there's a hybridization of the threat that is happening. And I want to go back to a point just to offer an interesting vignette just to reflect on. Maybe individuals asking questions will want to dive deeper on this, or if maybe somebody has more fidelity. But there's a case of a U.S. Army private last year, I'm sad to say, that began plotting online. He studied jihadist threat patterns. At the same time, he was talking to neo-Nazis in Europe, and he was going to kill Americans as they deployed, as I understand it, to Turkey. This is a hybridization of a threat where ideological dogmas are less of a problem. So I think what we're going to see is a broad buy-in to some ideological underpinning, and then you're going to have actors that are going to, as I say, they're going to latch on to local grievances, but they're not going to take their eye off of inspiring lone actors in the United States to act. We continue to see those kinds of scenarios play out. As late as last month, there was another, I believe, indictment of a would-be jihadist talking online to what he thought was an ISIS actor. So I am concerned of this hybridization. And to Mike's point, we can do more than one thing, and we're going to have to understand that there's this hybridization dynamic that's playing out, and we're going to have to keep our eyes on domestic threats as well as the foreign counterterrorism threat. That's why I say our friends that are now at the National Security Council and are charged with this business are going to focus on really two threat streams, but I think there's going to be a less dogmatic tie to ideologies. So I'll close there. I'm interested to hear what Karen has to offer, certainly.
Thanks, Chris. I want to just pull up on something you said and then something Mike said. And this idea of non-ideological but driven to violence with some sort of grievance is actually interesting when you look at the history of terrorist plots, terrorist actors, terrorist wannabes in the United States. We kept a database on this since 9/11 and at the center. And one of the things that was really interesting was individuals who originally tried to join a militia, then maybe tried to join some other group, and then tried to join essentially ISIS. in the years of ISIS. And so this non-ideological yet drive to violence and intense anger is just something to note and to, I just want to put a marker in here. This is something we really need to think about in terms of how we address things in a sort of cause level rather than a, results level. But the other thing I want to talk about, coming back to what Mike said, is the nation state. I like the name of this panel, local, global, glocal, whatever it is, but you get that in articulating it that way, what we've done is not address the nation state. Because local, we really are talking very locally as opposed to in these larger entities. And so great power rivalries is one thing, and we can talk about that. But what about the nation state, which is hid behind these proxy actors, which has, this has been true since 9/11. Let's just be very clear and very honest about it. We did not want to participate in the nation state conversation about who was backing the terrorists, right? We didn't want to go there. And now here we are 20 years later, and we're seeing almost like a recycling of so much of what we saw before. We're seeing it in Afghanistan with the resurgence of the Taliban and the idea of safe havens for terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And so I guess what I'm really trying to say here is two things. One, we need to, as a community, as an academic and national security community, think about the future of the nation state, what it is, what we've lost or what we've gained from this kind of erosion of its power and its legitimacy in terms of violent struggles in the world. And two, to get to the Glocal, the international community is actually very important here. And you'll notice that a lot of the attempts to address what's going on at Al-Hol, or Roj, to address what's going on, it's the UN that's setting out the directives, that's presenting the research, that's sort of trying to make the point that the answer to this has to be a truly international addressing of things. And I think that too has to do with the erosion of the nation state as the actor it used to be. So I just wanted to, so that's my answer.
Mike, it looked like you had some comment there, and I know you've been on the receiving end of some of those proxies, whether it's the concerns about where groups that Pakistan may have been supporting. You've already mentioned the Iranian-backed Houthis. Obviously, Iran has backed actors in Afghanistan over the years. And this is part of the equation, obviously, we've seen with this new administration in some of its early policy decisions, ending support for the Saudi-led offensive operations in Yemen, the key decisions President Biden is now facing in terms of a troop withdrawal deadline from Afghanistan that was set by his predecessor in the Taliban, and of course, looking at force levels that have been diminished in Iraq and in Syria. So where do we stand here with these proxies and the support they're getting from nation states?
That's a great question. It's very much on my mind these days. I'm going to answer that question, I think, in two ways. One is that because proxies increasingly have access to increasingly affordable high technology capabilities. A very obvious example of this is unmanned aerial systems, which are becoming more and more capable at a bewildering rate. This is such a powerful technology, and it gets better every month globally. And while the price of purchasing and employing this technology is collapsing, it is so inexpensive to weaponize an unmanned aerial system and use it for whatever violent act suits your purposes. But that's not the only example. That's the tip of the iceberg in terms of how the barrier to entry for anyone that has a small amount of money to weaponize themselves in ways that increasingly are rivaling what nation states can do. I personally think much of the international community is asleep at the switch on this. I would argue parts of the United States government are asleep at the switch at this. We were caught by surprise in 2014 by some of the troops that used to work for me in 2014 calling me and emailing me saying, hey, our Iraqi special forces colleagues are being attacked by ISIS drones. They're coming to us and asking us, what do you Americans have for this? And we had to say, we got nothing. So General Nagata, what do you got? And I had to say the same thing. I got nothing. That wasn't all that long ago. And that problem has only gotten worse. So the barriers to entry for high powerful technology are falling everywhere for these kinds of groups. So that's number one. Number two, this is going to sound like I'm making a bit of a divergence here, but I'm going to try to connect your question with something my two colleagues have just mentioned. One of the principal sources of fuel, sources of energy for the growth in violent extremism of any type is a collapse or a significant erosion of confidence between a nation state government, getting to Karen's point, and its own population, or at least a portion of its own population. What has COVID done for the past year? It has accelerated what I considered, if you'd asked me before COVID hit, was the relationship between most governments around the world, including potentially my own, and their populations. Are they eroding? Are they getting better? I would have said they're probably all eroding. Now, today, after COVID, I think that erosion has only accelerated, which creates a rich nutrient breeding ground for the kinds of terrorists or violent extremist groups that I've talked about, who very perversely have increasingly easy access to increasingly powerful technology that can be weaponized. I know that's pretty dismal, but that's what I stitched together mentally and listening to my two colleagues and then considering your question.
Well, Mike, you mentioned drones. One thing I've always wondered, and the other panelists please chime in, is why we haven't seen a greater threat, a cyber threat from various terrorist groups. Obviously, we're not going to see it on the level of a state actor, but I'm wondering if that's something you all fear as well, if going down this lane of using technology, at least defensively or from intelligence gathering, if not for some kind of offensive capability against asymmetric and against a larger country like the United States.
I'll give you a very short answer because I want to give time to my colleagues to reply as well. I think it's because they don't have to. I think they are reaping such enormous strategic dividends by the highly seductive propagandizing they do around the world, which is increasingly effective. As Chris said, I remember talking to an FBI agent before I retired. So they'd arrested someone in the United States, and they found both a Nazi flag and an ISIS flag hanging in his room. And they told this guy, "Hey, listen, man, you got to make up your mind." But it's funny that is. No, he doesn't. No, he doesn't. The collective, even however contradictory that may be, what this demonstrates is how successfully extremist groups are seducing people to take the path to violence. And we have no solution for that. So, and as long as that's true, if I were an ISIS planner, if I were an Al-Qaeda planner, if I were some ethnic supremacist group planner, and somebody say, "Hey, why aren't you doing more sophisticated, penetration of internet systems to wreak havoc in air traffic control systems?" My answer would be, because I don't have to. I am wildly successful without having to do something that hard.
Chris, you're nodding, but any thoughts on that?
I agree with what Mike said, and the one thing that didn't keep me up late at night, and there wasn't very much that didn't, was cyber. To Mike's point, I think terrorists in general, they want to see sensational spectacularity of physical violence, right? So we did look at capabilities that could be in the hands of terrorists from a cyber standpoint, but that's less of a threat that we zeroed in on. And our cyber colleagues certainly worry about the infrastructure, and we are worried about the nation states more so, I think. But that's going to change in time when terrorists completely process the full potential of the kind of violence that can play out and be complementary with the cyber intrusion. So I'll leave it at that.
Good. Karen and Charles, Karen had mentioned the Al-Hol camp in northeastern Syria, and in talking to General Frank McKenzie, the head of the Central Command, he's talked about that as being one of the biggest threats, future threats down the road, just basically a breeding ground with somewhere between 60 and 70,000 women, children, some men, in addition to the more than 10,000 fighters that are kept in a range of other camps. And, you know, there have been the attempts by the Trump administration to try and repatriate from these two different groups, and perhaps not surprisingly, very few takers from countries who just don't want these people back. Meantime, you have young, particularly the young people, and a whole camp I'm thinking particularly about, you really have a generation of young people growing up in an environment where ISIS is, my understanding from talking to colleagues who've been there, ISIS basically controls these camps now. Charles and Karen, you may know more about this, but when you have something like that, it's right out there for the international community. How big a priority should this be for the new administration, and what can they do about something like that? Karen, why don't we start with you and then go to Charles?
Okay, so the answer is it should be a very high priority, and it shouldn't just be the United States' priority. This is an international concern of mass dimensions. It's really hard to sound enough of an alarm bell. You know, almost half of these people you're talking about are children. Many of them are under 12. Imagine, and they're living in conditions that are deteriorating constantly, both because of the growth of the problem itself for IDPs and refugees, and because the resources that were brought to bear in the beginning are also disappearing, right? So, or, you know, the structures have been weakened. And so the real question is, how are we going to get at these children? How are we going to get at these families and give them lives worth living and things worth looking for, and not, and so what a lot of the military and international community has been saying over and over is they need to be repatriated and they need to be reintegrated into their societies. That is much easier said than done. And it is not just the repatriation part that needs to be focused on, it's the reintegration part. And we are at whatever zero, you know, ground zero in terms of thinking about this. This is, I can't stress enough how high a priority it is to take this as a global, you know, incentive to not just, it can't be just, oh, they're going to become terrorists. It has to be, these are people in our world community and we need to take care of them. And so I think if we could sort of shift it, that when we focus it on the national security, global security outcome, we lose something. And we put it on the, let's take care of these children. Let's think about what the world's going to be at the end of this century. We need to get a lot of buy-in. It can't just be the UN. And these old-fashioned terms, aid, development, you know, taking care of families. These need to be restored, reinvigorated, and an immense amount of time, energy, and resources need to be put into them.
And I'll, you know, I'll hop on there. I mean, I think it goes without saying that, you know, I totally agree with everything Karen said. This should have been a global #1 priority 5 years ago. We knew outright, we knew we were going to be dealing with a large number of people who, for one reason or another, were not going to be killed by you know, in Syria by the SDF or by our own aircraft. You know, I heard a bunch of conversations in the years preceding the territorial defeat of ISIS from senior US officials who, unsurprisingly, I won't name, who, when repeatedly asked, what are we going to do with, you know, the inevitability that we'll take all this territory, but there'll be some number of people left. One of them said, well, hopefully we'll kill as many of them before we take the last gasp, the last pocket of territory. That was the kind of, that was the solution. But they very much shut their eyes to the reality that we weren't going to kill all of these people. And many of them, of course, were going to be women and children. It's kind of extraordinarily frustrating that nobody ever wanted to take on this very difficult challenge. But we are where we are now. I think, given that most of these camps that we're talking about, like Roj and Al-Hol, are in Syria, you know, it's additionally concerning because, as anyone who's probably heard me speak about Syria, there is no good trajectory in Syria. We are only going to be going downhill Syria-wide in the next years, if not 10 to 20 years. There really is no light at the end of the tunnel for Syrian stability. And in the end, at some point, we will also leave Syria. And if we think that handing over 60 to 70,000 women and children who today we will hopefully be calling mostly victims, but also a large number of ISIS sympathizers to a regime who, as Mike and Chris certainly know full well, have an extensive precedent for working with Al-Qaeda in Iraq and then later with ISIS, then we're in a whole nother spot of bother long term, particularly given the Syrian regime's hostility towards us and the fact that they blame everything that's happened for the last 10 years on the West. So this really is something that has to be dealt with. But having said that, you know, it's also important to bear in mind and be honest about the challenges that, as Karen was saying, the repatriation and rehabilitation brings. These are huge numbers that we're talking about. I think we should clarify by saying that the US has actually done a comparatively good job at repatriating both ISIS fighters, but also American citizens when you compare it to Europe's response, which has been, you know, at best negligible. But there's a reason for that. The numbers in Europe's case are huge. And from a domestic intelligence perspective, there just simply are not the resources to deal with these numbers without inevitably just accepting some significant escalation of risk. And as we should know, having watched ISIS, women are not necessarily innocent bystanders in the ISIS cause. They certainly haven't been in Syria and Iraq. And whether or not most of them are victims or not, from an intelligence perspective, I do also understand why everyone has been so keen to put up a wall and prevent repatriation. So it's a hell of a tricky dilemma. The only other thing I would say here is, I mean, my personal opinion is we should, despite the risk, be repatriating our own citizens, because I think that's largely a reflection of international law. It is our responsibility whether we like it or not. But secondarily, you know, speaking from the Middle East Institute, one of our non-resident scholars, Vera Mironova, has done some amazing research on the camps, on ISIS members inside the camps or ISIS sympathizers within the camps. And one of her findings by interviewing a lot of residents of these camps has been that many of the adult women had become so deeply disenchanted with the ISIS cause, having lived through you know, years of OIR bombing, and having been forced to essentially follow the retreat for so long. But now being stuck in these camps, many of them are actually re-embracing the ISIS ideology in an outward sense in order to essentially remain safe, because there are also very hardcore ISIS loyalists still in the camps themselves, and we've seen a string of assassinations just in the last couple of weeks. And I think the longer that kind of pretend sympathy with ISIS continues, the much higher likelihood is that pretend sympathizing becomes more real again. Particularly, as Karen says, the conditions in the camps continue to deteriorate. There's no light at the end of the tunnel, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not just a very significant problem, but frankly, it's a problem that we need to be dealing with yesterday, not you know, next year. And there was news yesterday, I think, that the UK has funded the doubling in size of one of the main prison camps in Syria. You know, I think from a security perspective, that's a good thing, but it's not sending the right message. It's sending the message that, no, we're still not going to take any of these people home. They are staying in Syria. And as I said, the long-term implications of keeping them in Syria are not good, because we should not have 1% of faith in Damascus to do anything right with any of these people.
I just wanted to remind our viewers, we're going to speak among ourselves for a few more minutes, but I want to remind our viewers to send your questions in. I see there the Q&A folder is filling up, so that's great. We're going to spend the last half hour or so taking your questions. I wanted to spend these last few minutes, after we've kind of painted this rather gloomy assessment of where things stand, both on the domestic and international front, to put your hats on. You all have served either in advisory roles or in government itself. I mean, this is a new administration coming in. They're starting to work on a new national security strategy. Presumably, eventually, they'll get around to a new national counterterrorism strategy as well. Some things I've noted, kind of, you know, we kind of a sign that maybe kind of counterterrorism isn't one of the top priorities of this administration. You see reports that the counter-ISIS envoy job, John Allen, Brett McGurk's old job, is going to be folded back into the state CT job. Maybe we can ask John Godfrey a little bit about that later today. No names on the horizon unless Mike or Chris, you know, at NCTC in terms of a new director there. But curious as to what, both on the international side, what they should be thinking about, but also on the domestic side, is the concern about maybe there's a need for new legislation to deal with domestic terrorism crimes that bumps up against First Amendment issues. So put your advisor hats on for the next few minutes, each of you, please, and kind of talk about what you would be advising to this new team that's kind of getting its arms around a number of things, whether it's dealing with the threats we've talked about in the VEO standpoint, or in the state-sponsored realm, as we already have been discussing, particularly in the area of Afghanistan, I think. Chris, you want to start us off?
Yeah, I'll kick this off. So first of all, I would remind any administration that's incoming, to include the Biden administration, that during the early days of the Trump administration, when I started out as the counterterrorism senior director, folks wanted to dismiss CT, even though it was a significant priority leading up to Inauguration Day. Folks wanted to focus more on other broader policy issues. So my predecessor working counterterrorism enjoyed a greater hearing early on because the team came in all excited about other policy objectives. That said, counterterrorism has a tendency to be a spoiler. So I would submit, even if the Biden administration is wanting to zero in on other priorities, wanted to pivot to bigger things like China, for example, counterterrorism has a way of drawing you back in, because we haven't solved a lot of the issues that we've talked about here today, the grievances, the ideology. I will offer, though, if I can present some good news, and this kind of addresses your question, there's been a lot of learning from our foreign partners. And our foreign partners, Mike and I have worked with Iraqis, we've worked on the ground with Afghans. I've been on the ground and talked to CT practitioners in Somalia. It's our foreign partners that are going to bear a heavy load in the future. And I submit that there's been a lot of learning, and our foreign partners, in particular, the Iraqis, are ready to take on more of that load. We've seen some great progress in January going after ISIS leadership. And we've seen the Iraqi CT forces go after sleeper cells and militant financiers. So I am optimistic that our foreign partners are set to take a bigger load. In Somalia, if I could close with an example, the Danab, who have been great foreign partners, we've trained them very well. The concerns that they're going to have going forward, and there's been some media on this, are going to be risking politicization by the Somalis themselves. So those are the things that we have to monitor, and we have to work with our foreign partners. But at the end of the day, counterterrorism is going to remain a significant issue for this administration and future administrations, whether they like it or not. And the last point I'll make on domestic terrorism is we have to always, and I think Karen got to this point, alluded to it, and certainly it was implicit in some of her remarks. We have to be careful with domestic terrorism because we're talking about fellow Americans. So we can't castigate and alienate our own population. So we can't overreach. We can't over-militarize policing. And that it's got to be handled very, very delicately. But at the end of the day, political violence is political violence. No ends justifies any means.
Karen?
Yeah, well, I'm glad Chris ended on that note, because I can start with the domestic terrorism and then move into the larger conversation, which is that, you know, I think at this point, I know there's a lot of call for a domestic terrorism statute. anything that's done, there's a law for already. We have not had a problem prosecuting domestic terrorists. I understand it gives more powers to policing powers, in the ways it was done for international terrorists, but I think maybe enough already. And that, designating domestic terrorist groups, which could happen, doesn't have to happen in the domestic terrorism statute. I'm just not sure that's the most viable or robust way forward. Having said that, there still is a threat we have to address, and as Chris said, these crimes need to be addressed, as does the national conversation. But I want to turn a little bit to the Middle East in its largest sense, and just talk about the idea about what we need to do is very much in lines of ramp up what Mike was talking about, and Charles, about what we've done abroad militarily, intelligence services wide, etc. And I know I'm repeating myself, but there needs to be a diplomatic strategy. It will include counterterrorism. There needs to be a global economic strategy. It will include counterterrorism. It's fine that they repurposed or replaced where they wanted counterterrorism to be. I think that's a sign that it's part of everything. And while there be a focus with certain tools that we know and certain focuses in this counterterrorism department, the idea of counterterrorism not being throughout everything else, but not necessarily named counterterrorism and done in the name of counterterrorism, along the lines of what I was saying before, which is let's address the things that lead to terrorism as part of our counterterrorism strategy. I think we can easily expect that from this administration. And so I don't think it's a narrowing of it. I think it's an acceptance of how broad it is and how there are different tools, and certain tools will be handled by the counterterrorism division, and leave it at that.
Mike, I mean, you've been steeped in this. Do you agree with that assessment? I mean, do you agree with, folding that McGurk job back into the state CT role?
Well, on that particular point, I suppose I could make arguments on either side of that question, whether or not there should or should not be a unique or separated ISIS envoy. Personally, for me, that's kind of beside the point. I think that's a technical, tactical choice that might be important, but compared to the strategic wins that I think all my colleagues have been talking about, it's not comparatively very important. So let me get to the points that I wanted to make here. The first thing I would offer in terms of advice is we really have to disabuse ourselves of the notion that we have the luxury of choosing whether to focus on terrorism or something else like great power competition. We do not have that luxury. And it's at least for two reasons. One, which I won't go on about because I've already made this point, I think they're increasingly converging with each other. But whether or not that's true, terrorism will not be ignored. Arguably, we're trying to pivot to great power competition these days in Washington, D.C. I think I personally lived, this is now, I think, the third attempt I've seen my government make to try to pivot away from terrorism. One of them was our decision to pivot away from Iraq in 2011, only to have ISIS blow up in our face several years later. The other one was and I'm really not trying to make fun here, I understand why it was happening, the pivot to Asia until Benghazi happened. And I mean, I was on the joint staff at the time. A lot of the stuff we sent to Asia, we had to pull right back to Africa because of Benghazi. So terrorism will simply not be ignored. No matter how much we want to ignore it, it won't let us. But I think the most important policy advice I would give if I had the opportunity was we really have to create the internal self-discipline and cognitive awareness that the very important investments we have made, which we should sustain, to use military or law enforcement tools, I'm saying this oversimply, but to save lives. That's very important, but it is not the most important thing we should be doing. It's the most dramatic, it's the most famous. That's what you see TV shows and movies made about, saving lives, rescuing hostages. It's awesome stuff. We should do all of that we can. But what you almost never hear about here in terms of serious discussion in this town, I've seen this problem internationally as well, it's not unique to us, is the much more complex, much more difficult much more intellectually and politically challenging task of preventing people in our own populations from becoming terrorists to begin with. Because the saving lives things, all that stuff, that's mowing the grass. The grass will come back. Preventing people, vulnerable people, like in the Al-Hol camp, from becoming terrorists to begin with is the challenge of our time when it comes to terrorism. And right now, personal opinion, the international community is failing at this.
That's a good place to stop. And I think we're going to switch over to our questions. And Charles, you're going to get the first one from Eric Rosand, a former colleague of yours, focused on the State Department. Eric asks, what does counterterrorism look like if we need to focus more on addressing grievances and perhaps less on killing and capturing terrorists? Charles, you want to take that first?
That's a good question, and it sort of allows me to pick up on some of the points that my colleagues have made just over the last few minutes. I mean, I think the first and most important thing to say here is, if we acknowledge that we can't defeat, let alone contain, the terrorist threat purely by military means, which we should have acknowledged a long time ago. I think we probably did, but we didn't necessarily act on it. But if we take that as a starting point, then we also have to accept that the United States of America cannot do this job alone, or even necessarily from the front. I think that we have to, sort of give ourselves a pat on the back for having become extremely astute and very effective at doing the kinetic part. But we've got obviously a very long way to go on the longer term question, which as most of my colleagues have already said, has a lot more to do with big unpopular words like development, stabilization, good governance. We're not going to solve those things by ourselves, and we're certainly not going to solve them overnight. And frankly speaking, it's one of the problems of being a sort of electoral democracy, that every 4 or 8 years we have new leadership who want to do things slightly differently to their predecessors, and also worry about being re-elected. And tackling those big word questions has become increasingly unpopular. There is a reason why the new administration has talked very little about the Middle East, with the exception of Iran diplomacy, and it's because there is no popular support at home for doing nearly anything in the Middle East, let alone getting involved in development, state building, governance, and what have you. But until we, as our government, make those decisions and essentially commit to a longer term strategy, we're going to continue to have these very same conversations every year or every 5 years. And every time we have those conversations, we're going to be talking about bigger numbers and a longer list of countries that we need to be worried about. And that's what I and every other person who works in this field is most frustrated about. We also need to do what this administration has talked a lot about, which is to kind of revitalize and reinforce multilateral efforts on all kinds of things, but including this. One of the kind of propositions I might propose here is that if you put together a multilateral effort to combat violent extremism or combat the drivers of violent extremism, perhaps then we lock ourselves into an initiative that can last beyond the first administration that signs up to it. Perhaps that gives us more hope of doing something for more than 4 years than simply having a US counterterrorism strategy that commits to do something for 4 years or 8 years and then gets subtly changed the next time around. Another sort of acknowledgement we have to make is exactly what Mike said, which is to acknowledge that state actors and non-state actors have become essentially one and the same in this topic of conversation we're talking about today. So we can't, I think it's frankly naive to think that we can make Iran a better and less malign actor in the Middle East solely by resolving the nuclear issue, when we know the first time around it escalated its other non-nuclear related malign activities in the region. And we're only now starting to see the consequences of that. The Houthis controlling the vast majority of Yemen. Hezbollah has become a transnational actor that's training proxies itself now without Iranian IRGC assistance. You know, the Syrian regime would not be where it is today if it wasn't for the tens of thousands of militiamen that Iran put together post JCPOA. And that's not me saying that a nuclear agreement isn't important. It is. I think we're much better with one than we are without. But it would be extremely naive to think that by pursuing a nuclear agreement, we will suddenly you know, dissolve all of those other malign activities. If we can't learn that lesson this time around, then we're truly hopeless. Another thing I would propose, and again, this is coming particularly from this from a Syrian analyst perspective, is we simply cannot ignore terrorism because it's currently locally oriented. You know, one of the things I've grown most worried about over the past 10 years is the ability of terrorist organizations who 10 years ago were largely globally oriented and much smaller in number, to have learned lessons far quicker and to have adapted to those lessons learned far quicker than we have. And to the extent to which, obviously in Afghanistan, we have a Taliban which has not just survived, but arguably grown in strength throughout our occupation and war in the country. But intriguingly, from a Syrian perspective, we have a former Al-Qaeda affiliate that now has a semi-technocratic governing body that engages with international NGOs, disseminates international aid assistance, you know, is seeking to establish political relationships with foreign governments, just welcomed PBS and the New York Times to Idlib to meet with their leader, who was wearing a suit and not his traditional jihadist garb. You know, some of that is for image, but some of it is also real. And I think it's profoundly worrying because we really don't have a response to groups that operate like that. The deeper and more locally oriented groups like this become, the harder it is for us to tackle them. We either have a choice of giving them credibility and legitimacy and seeing them as part of a political process, or we continue to fight them from the outside. But in my opinion, in so doing, we actually risk furthering their local credibility and further kind of mainstreaming that extremist approach to local politics as well as conflict. So we've got to also think very carefully about how we address those challenges.
This question is for, I think for Mike from Veera Krishna. If technology is being easily accessed by terrorists these days, could there be a situation in the future of terrorists accessing nuclear technology, especially in the case of the Houthis in Iran?
I think the answer is perhaps yes, although again, I'm gonna try once again, rather imperfectly, to try to put myself in the mind of someone who plans for an extremist group. I think my reaction to that would be, okay, we might be able to do that, but it's really hard because security systems for nuclear weapons are pretty robust, and non-nuclear technology, in fact, non-kinetic technology is becoming so much more powerful with every passing month. And those things are abundantly available. Why bother? Why bother? I mean, here's an example. I say this with some caution because I don't want somebody to go out and try doing this, but you know, increasingly powerful substances like fentanyl and a commercially available drone and an aerosol dispersing device. I mean, you could conceptually kill hundreds of people with a combination like that. I don't want that to happen, but all of those things can be procured either through a legitimate commercial purpose, through a legitimately commercial process, or are just readily available on the criminal market and without much risk. So you can create spectacular results without resorting to a very complex and challenging effort. of trying to procure a nuclear device. I'm not saying it's impossible. Perhaps there's some people around the world who are plotting to do that very thing. I think if I were advising their leadership, I'd say, what are you doing? That's so hard. You could get the results you want much more cheaply, much easier. Just look at what is becoming available to anyone with a credit card anywhere in the world. You can kill hundreds or thousands of people without resorting to that.
Karen, Mibin Mamin asks, can you talk a little bit more about the strategies that you would recommend to address the virtual radicalization that's now being carried out by extremist groups? And I presume that means both internationally and maybe even domestically.
Yeah, and I think this is the point where we talk about how, the weapon of disinformation, the weapon of online radicalization, which we really haven't talked a lot about. So I'm grateful that this is now on the table. Look, I think there's a couple of things about these strategies that I want to just point out. One is that we talk as if there's some kind of sweeping answer for the globe. I actually think one of the things that has to be done for thinking about online radicalization is that it has to be addressed differently in different contexts. The idea that we're going to use the same strategy here or in Syria or even in parts of Africa seems to me just counterproductive. And I think right now we are thinking in terms of what's the best, general idea. I think we need to break it down. And I think those online strategies have to be tailored to the situation that they're in. And I'm not on the inside, but I don't read about or hear about in my conversations enough of that. And so as a result, it sort of inspires a larger global conversation when actually, as we've talked about, these are local and national issues, and we need to address them that way and get in the conversation in that way to be able to focus it away from this larger transnational group. So that's one thing. I think the second thing is, just in terms of just this overall thing, is that we need to think about short-term versus long-term. That there has to be a short-term strategy for how to do this, and this is virtually and not virtually, and a long-term. And much as we talk about, is it great power rivalries or, are we talking about counterterrorism? We also don't talk enough about being able to, chew gum and whatever you're supposed to do at walk at the same time, in terms of thinking about the short-term strategy and how to address it and the long-term strategy. And that's true in the virtual sphere as well as elsewhere.
Great. Another former colleague of yours, Terry Wolf, asks, and I'm going to pitch this to Chris. General Wolf asks, and we got a little bit of this, but he wants to drill down a little bit more. How should the US and other nations change our counterterrorism and VEO strategy, and what specifically should the Biden team do differently than the Trump team did?
So first, it's good to hear from General Wolf. I would argue that, I can make the point that I came on board wanting to focus on a prevention architecture. I did not have the luxury to do that for the points that I already made, because we had to focus on, again, taking away the physical caliphate in particular. So I would argue that what we need to do is combine the idea of working with partners and funding for things like a terrorism prevention architecture. Countries are doing it much better than they have historically. The Iraqis, for one, I have had an opportunity to talk to Iraqi practitioners just this year, and I was heartened by what I heard insofar as their ability to work on counter-radicalization. So now is the time to redouble our focus, and I'm glad Karen's put such a fine point on it. We have to focus, and Mike as well, we have to focus on a terrorism prevention architecture. So I would say that the new crew at the National Security Council, they do not have the luxury of not focusing on countering radicalization. Now is the time to get at those problems in bigger ways than we have historically. And I like kind of the fresh idea that Karen offered. We've got to work with our foreign partners. We have to fund these efforts. I mean, even here in the United States, we do not do a phenomenal job of former terrorists when they're released from our prison system. Of course, our prison system is not a magnet for jihadists like even some countries in Europe had significant radicalization problems. So we need to focus on the prevention architecture. So that's what I'd offer to the general. It's a fair question. I would not set aside prevention issues. I would focus and redouble our efforts to fund those efforts with foreign partners and establish metrics of success. We've got to do that. We don't have the luxury to wait.
Mike, did you want to add something to that?
Yes, I'll be very quick. What I'm about to say may be surprising or perhaps even disagreeable to some of the people in the audience. This is something I became convinced of in the 3 years I spent at the National Counterterrorism Center. Chris and I have talked about what I'm about to say a lot. We need significant investments in more research into the question, why does someone become a terrorist? I will stipulate, and I'll get off my soapbox, it's not that we know nothing about why somebody becomes a terrorist. We don't know enough. By no stretch of the imagination do we understand this problem well enough. And it's a basic shortage of empirical scientific research into this question. If you examine how much actual scientific research goes into trying to answer this question, it is wafer thin. So there's too much opinion and speculation about this and not enough facts.
Eric, can I just tag on to something there? One of the things that hasn't been addressed that comes up in, what are the drivers to radicalization is actually very important to mention here, which is the absence of a national identity. That identity issues seem to be attractive everywhere, not just here, but globally and within these contexts. And as the nation state withers away, as refugees leave one country and then are stateless in another country, as you have this growing, IDP population, you have the issue of national identity increased exponentially, and of identity of any sort. And that in and of itself seems to be a psychological driver to identification with these groups. To belonging. And so a kind of, where can I get my identity? Where is my group? And so I just want to put that out there, that I think what you're saying is really important. And there are many things like that we haven't really acknowledged, and how they interact with what's happening in the world at large.
Can I also just jump in? I just had a quick to piggyback on all of those points and say perhaps another thing like Mike, and trying to be a little bit provocative, but I think comments from most of us have seemed to suggest that ideology is not necessarily always the central reason for why terrorism exists, for why someone joins a terrorist organization. The many or most, if not all, of the underlying grievances and drivers have nothing to do with an extreme ideology, and much more to do with, sort of local dynamics and local experience. So if there is a kind of consensus that that is the case, then one thing seems to be glaringly missing from our counterterrorism strategies going a long way back, which is that there is no off-ramp for individuals, but particularly for organizations. So to sort of reassert that or reiterate that, if we believe that extremist ideologies have little to do with why terrorist organizations become meaningful in size, in other words, the way that they manage to recruit people, then not only should we, when necessary, be going out and using kinetic actions to deal with these nefarious actors, but there also ought to be some kind of an incentive to de-incentivize joining terrorist organizations. But at the moment, we as the US, but also frankly all of our allies, have an overly black and white lens through which we view this problem set. And to put it kind of crassly, it's, if you become a terrorist, you are always a terrorist until we kill you or put you in prison for life. If you come out of prison, you are still a terrorist in our eyes. And in some cases that might be true, but in many cases it doesn't necessarily have to be that simple. And by failing to acknowledge that and act on it and create that off-ramp, we're actually exacerbating the very problem that we're trying to deal with. And as part of that, well, I think we also need to look at our designation policy, which in some ways is sort of very out of date and doesn't seem to be kind of re-looked at. But in particular, there's no off-ramp. So we don't classify, as far as I'm aware, the Taliban as a terrorist organization. We openly negotiate with it, and yet the Taliban still receives an oath of allegiance from Al-Qaeda, who we're killing worldwide. So the Taliban officially is in charge of Al-Qaeda in terms of allegiance, and yet we don't classify the Taliban, but we do classify Al-Qaeda. We classify the PKK as a terrorist organization, and as I've said before, the State Department and the CIA have always maintained that the YPG in Syria was the Syrian wing of the PKK, and yet they have become our most invaluable partner in countering another terrorist organization in ISIS. And all serving officials will do everything they can not to acknowledge that the YPG is the Syrian wing of the PKK. And that's not to take away from the fact that the YPG and the SDF have done heroic and extremely valuable work, and they have proven to be a very loyal partner. And yet we still have this kind of blurry problem with our designations, and that's just two examples. And the reason probably I'm raising that is because there has been behind the scenes a quite intensive discussion about this group HTS in Syria, and if we should be testing them on their determination to engage with foreign governments. I mean, if we continue, as we have said, the State Department CT Bureau has been tweeting, the Rewards for Justice program tweeted in response to HTS's leaders meeting with foreign journalists by saying, well, we're still offering $10 million to have your head on a platter. You know, if that's our way of trying to incentivize terrorist organizations to improve their behavior, then, you know, our entire strategy here is damned from the start, because we're never going to kill these organizations out of existence. There has to be some kind of an off-ramp and an incentive to depart from those behaviors and those ideologies. So I think there's really a core problem at the very top in terms of how we view, or the lens through which we view this problem set.
Can I just jump in there, Eric, real quick? To put a finer point on this idea of off-ramps. The reason off-ramps are so challenging, and I've sat in a room with a kid that was on the cusp of being an Al-Qaeda adherent or an ISIS adherent, and the US attorney experimented and allowed an off-ramp for this kid that could have otherwise been prosecuted to the full extent of the law. I applaud those efforts. We've written off-ramps into the 2018 strategy. Whether that strategy continues, I don't know. But the point is there's risk that comes with off-ramps. So if a US attorney accepts the idea that we're going to have a pathway to allow somebody that's otherwise radicalized to have a path to normalcy for the rest of that US attorney's life in the US government, and life for that matter, he has to worry, is that individual going to go back on that path? Is he going to fall off the wagon, so to speak? So there's a lot of risk that comes from off-ramps, and the law enforcement community itself is not going to be a huge advocate for those kinds of programs. So you have to force them. And as I've said, I've seen advantages of having a former terrorist talk to somebody that's in the radicalization process, and at the end of the day, we'll have some tactical successes, but more broadly, it comes with a risk. And sometimes the US government is not going to accept that risk.
But it's not really that different. It's not really that different than criminal justice generally. It is a risk in all of these cases when you determine a sentence or conditions of release. And in many of these terrorism cases, the crimes are crimes of intent rather than crimes of doing. So I just want to put in a little bit of a disagreement there. Okay, sorry.
Mike Christopher Hammond asks, we keep hearing about needing to do all these things, peer-to-peer, domestic CT, foreign CT. However, resources are finite. And in addition, certain global powers benefit from the distractions and therefore will not help. So what is the path forward based on limited resources and a lack of global care and concern?
Well, I think the path to success is completely, I mean, this is going to such a blinding flash of the eye. It depends on what choices we make. I think what we're all collectively advocating is the choice we should be making is not to turn away from necessary military intelligence or law enforcement work if otherwise people are going to die. We should keep doing that. We've gotten quite good at those things, not just the United States, but much of the world has become quite good at those things when necessary. We just have to realize that we're not going to win that way. We're not going to solve the problem that way. They're absolutely necessary to save lives, but they don't solve the problem. And one of the things I did while I was responsible for strategy at the National Counterterrorism Center is I did some comparative analysis. Chris probably remembers this. What's the cost of capturing and killing people around the world? Really, really expensive. The exquisite intelligence, military, law enforcement capabilities you have to create and sustain indefinitely, they are very costly, but necessary. And then what's the cost? What's the comparative cost of doing some of the things my three colleagues have talked about? Civil society work, governance work, educational work, work with local communities and local actors to try to identify those people that are vulnerable to taking the path to terrorism and somehow persuade them not to make that choice. Pennies on the dollar. It is so inexpensive compared to the massive amounts of money we have to inject into being able to target people either for law enforcement or military endgames. So if we were to make, in my view, if we were to make the wise strategic choice of investing more heavily in terrorism prevention, I'll use that term because I don't want to go on endlessly here. It's not that it would be free, but compared to the amount of money we have to lavish, this gets to the limited resources part of the question, compared to the amount of money we have to lavish on saving lives, pennies on the dollar. I think we would be shocked to realize how relatively inexpensive it is. Not free, but relatively inexpensive.
Karen Rombarts asks, how do we stop funding more authoritarian-leaning governments who will use their CT knowledge and equipment against their own people or minorities in their country in the wider region to get information they want? How big a problem is that?
So I'm not sure I understand it. Could you just read the last part of it?
Sure. How do we stop funding more authoritarian-leaning governments who will use counterterrorism knowledge or equipment against their own people or minorities in their country?
Right. I mean, this is something the Biden administration has actually kind of laid out in its early efforts, which is not so much attached to CT, but the idea that you can have two narratives going on with another country at the same time, one that's attached to whatever agenda it is, climate change, nuclear nonproliferation, et cetera, and yet really focus in on don't do that. Don't do that, which is sort of violating the codes that we understand of what we're for. And I think that translates into how CT powers are used elsewhere. And there's no country that's immune from that. So the question is, can we do that in a way, not be hypocritical about it, and understand what we actually mean by don't use these methods for counterterrorism?
We're down to our last 3 minutes or so we're going to go to a lightning round for the four of you. And what I want you to do is give me in your shortest, briefest answer, one area or one thing that you're most concerned about, we may or may not have touched on today, but particularly if you haven't touched on it. And then to kind of end on a more uplifting note, what's a more positive thing that you've seen transpire in the last few years, or that you think this new administration coming in, as Karen kind of alluded to just now, it's something a little bit more kind of look on the more optimistic side. Why don't we start with Charles?
Okay, I'm not very good at being short and concise, but I'll do my best. So I think the most concerning thing for me is the return of dictatorial rule across most of the regions that we worry the most about when it comes to the terrorism space, along with the proliferation of ungoverned spaces, failing governance, economic weakness and decline, and a youth bulge. So all of those things put together are kind of a perfect recipe for the likes of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, or any new organization that might emerge. And we're definitely seeing that in Africa in multiple hotspots that we probably never imagined we would be seeing ISIS operate.
Okay, that's good, Charles. That's good. Now I want an upbeat one.
Okay,
This is lightning round.
See,
Lightning round.
I told you I wasn't good. Upbeat. I think what we did in Syria and Iraq was very effective. By, with, and through partnering with local actors was very effective, and we can learn a lot from that.
Good, Chris.
Those individuals that have been radicalized in the detainee camps in Syria and Iraq, the future threat emanates from there. And secondly, on a good note, and I've already alluded to it, it's our foreign partners. They've come a long way. I noted the Somalis, and I've noted the Iraqis, just to name two.
Great. Mike?
I'm just going to repeat a couple of things I've already said. First, the thing that worries me the most is what I think is happening globally, including inside the United States. The continuing erosion of confidence between populations everywhere and their government, which creates a rich nutrient breeding ground for violent extremism. The thing that, this is going to sound a little perverse, but the uplifting thing or the positive thing is, I think what I'm seeing both for the United States as well as other countries around the world, I'm going to riff off of something Winston Churchill famously said about Americans. They'll always do the right thing after they've exhausted every other alternative. One of these days, we're going to exhaust every alternative to preventing people from becoming terrorists to begin with. And hopefully on that day, we will start actually focusing on it as the actual solution.
Great. Karen, last word.
Yeah, so the thing we didn't talk about was the fact that this issue is not going away. The drivers aren't going away, largely because of climate change. That we didn't talk about how famine and the drying up of resources like water are going to intensify the problem in our lifetimes. The opportunity, the good news is that we should see this as an opportunity. How do we take these individuals in Al Hol and Roj and elsewhere and really think about ways we can transform the world? And the further opportunity is, it's not us, it's our kids that are going to have to, help us figure this out.
Great. Well, thank you all, and thank you for MEI for sponsoring this, and stay tuned for the other panels.